مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. أخيرا وبعد أكثر من عامين من استيلاء قوات الدولة الإسلامية الشريرة على ثاني أكبر مدينة في العراق تحررت الموصل، ومما يحسب للجنود العراقيين أنهم مهدوا الطريق لتحقيق هذا النصر المهم، ومع اقتراب جنود عرب وأكراد متحالفين مع أمريكا من تحرير مدينة الرقة السورية، قد لا تعود هناك أراضي تسيطر عليها الدولة الإسلامية أما قريب، ودون أراضي لن يكون للخلافة وجود بطبيعة الحال. ربما تكون المعارك قد انتهت بالنصر، ولكن الحرب لم تضع أوزارها بعد، فحتى دون أراضي ما تزال داعش تمثل تهديدا إرهابيا خطيرا في الشرق الأوسط وحول العالم. وفي المنطقة كثير من الأطراف الفاعلة يسارعون بالفعل لملء الفراغ الذي خلفته داعش. هل يمكن أن يسود السلام والأمن أبدا إن كان سقوط داعش يعني صعود إيران وحزب الله وبشار الأسد؟ لمناقشة سياسة إدارة ترامب في الشرق الأوسط بعد سقوط الموصل والرقة، يسرني أن أرحب بمراقبين حكيمين للسياسة الخارجية الأمريكية، وهما دينيس روس وبراين ماكاون. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Well, it wasn't quite a mission accomplished moment, but the liberation of Mosul was a huge step in the fight against ISIS, or Daesh, as it is known. And to talk about where we go next in the post-Mosul era, and perhaps in the post-Raqqa era, I'm delighted to welcome our two experts on foreign policy, Brian Macowen and Denis Ross. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
So, the liberation of Mosul, huge moment. Who gets credit for this victory? Brian, let me begin with you.
Well, the Iraqi security forces and the Prime Minister of Iraq and the United States military and our coalition partners. It was a real team effort. The Iraqis did the fighting on the ground, and they took a lot of casualties, and we've assisted them through our training and our air power and intelligence and a number of other ways that the United States military can engage in combat.
Denis, winning the battle doesn't always mean winning the war. So what do we have on the immediate agenda just in the Iraq arena? And then we'll talk about the broader arena in a moment.
Right. I think it's a good way to think about it, that this was a battle in a war. One of the great dangers is if there's going to be a vacuum that gets filled by the worst forces, well, we've seen what happens in Iraq and in Syria when that's what materializes. So I think the challenge now is, can there be a plan that provides for real reconstruction, security, governance, and inclusion? That's a tall order. If you look at Ramadi and Fallujah today, there hasn't been a whole lot of reconstruction. Being able to mobilize the resources to be able to do that, helping to ensure that there's security, so those who've been forced to leave in Mosul, you had 1 million people who were forced to leave, and they're not rushing back right now, not only because there's a lot of ordnance, there's a lot of bombs that are out there that makes it still a dangerous area, but also it's not clear what you come back to. So there's going to have to be an approach that, even though it doesn't have to happen instantaneously, because it's not going to happen instantaneously, there has to be a kind of pattern here of incremental improvements. In a lot of ways, the Prime Minister of Iraq gets credit, including from the Sunni population, for what's been done. The memory of ISIS, of Daesh, is not going to disappear overnight. The brutality, the intolerance, the the impossibility of living a life, all that's very present. But if the reconstruction doesn't unfold, if there's no sense of security, if Shia militias look like they're taking over again, with the same kind of sectarianism that we've seen in the past, then the conditions that produce ISIS in the first place are going to create a son of ISIS at some point within the next few years. So there's an opportunity here, but there's also a great danger as well.
So, Brian, we've seen this movie before. This is not totally different from the experience years ago in the noughts in the mid-2000s when we defeated Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then ISIS eventually emerged out of that rubble. What lessons should we draw from that experience and apply it to this moment?
Well, the first thing I'd say is the war is definitely not over, even in Iraq. Although there's been victory in Mosul, there are elements of Daesh in western Anbar province and Tal Afar, and so there's more hard fighting ahead for the Iraqis and the coalition. But the lesson of the last decade is that the government of Iraq needs to govern, as Dennis said, by inclusion. The three elements in Iraq, the Kurds, the Shias, and the Sunnis, a lot of those hard political issues are still there. They have not gone away during the period where Daesh has dominated territory in Iraq. And so it's going to take some hard politics by the political leadership and hard choices. We haven't yet seen any Nelson Mandelas in Iraq, but Prime Minister Abadi is an improvement over Prime Minister Maliki in trying to govern inclusively. It's not helpful, for example, that the Kurds have scheduled a referendum on independence in September, and the Trump administration has come out against that and tried to persuade them to cancel it. So the lesson will be politics needs to break out. It's going to need coaxing from the United States and the Sunni states in the Middle East, the Saudis, the Gulf states. They have held back because they didn't like the influence of the Shiites in Baghdad. We need their political help as well as their financial help to help stabilize and rebuild Iraq.
And what do you see as the midterm role for American forces in Iraq? Will we still be deployed in Iraq, even, let's say, after the fighting concludes in Anbar?
That's a decision that still needs to be made between the United States and Iraq, and ultimately that's Iraq's decision. We're there as guests of the sovereign state of Iraq. I think the judgment of the security specialists and the military would be we should not depart wholesale in the same way that we did in 2011 pursuant to the agreement that President Bush signed, that we should leave some small force to assist with training and assist the Iraqi security forces with security challenges. It need not be a very big footprint, but obviously this is a political issue as much as anything for the government of Iraq, so we have to be sensitive to that.
And so, Dennis, are there any additional lessons from previous experience you think apply themselves to this moment?
Well, I do think Brian put his finger on the fact that if the politics aren't managed, then you're likely to recreate a lot of what we've seen. And the truth is the core political differences were never resolved. The issue over the dispute over the internal boundaries as it relates primarily to the Kurds, the issue of Sunni empowerment, the question of how you share even revenues. I mean, these are issues that have not been sorted out, and you have Iran's influence, because Iran is manipulating many of the popular mobilization units of the different Shia militias and the Badr organization, and they use that as a lever. That, by the way, I think is a kind of lesson from the past in terms of if we can maintain an American military presence, even if the footprint isn't large, it does create a counterweight of sorts. And building up the Iraqi military now, which now has a kind of credibility precisely because of their success on the ground, even though it's come at a high price, that actually has added to the credibility of the Iraqi security forces. The question of helping to ensure that Abadi can resist and has some counterweight to the Iranians, I think becomes very important. That too is a lesson from the past.
So let's move for a moment to the Syria theater, at least broaden our discussion a bit. There's fighting up in the Raqqa area, and there's fighting down in south The United States is engaged in different ways in both arenas, but we're less engaged in Syria, obviously, than we are in Iraq. How would you characterize the different type of American engagement in Syria than what we see in Iraq?
Well, the size of our footprint is a little bit smaller. That's probably the main difference, but the fundamental strategy is the same, which is it was put in place by President Obama and has largely been continued under President Trump, which is a strategy of by, with, and through partners. We are training people on the ground, in this case, the Syrian Democratic Forces that are enveloping Raqqa and tribal elements down in the south. We're training them and equipping them to fight against Daesh. We're having considerable but slow success. Raqqa is now largely surrounded. The ISIS elements will have difficulty getting out of the city, but it's going to be a hard fight like Mosul. It's a large city, and ISIS is willing to stay there and fight to the death and take civilian casualties down with them. It seems like some of their leadership has already escaped to the east, and ultimately the last battle in Syria will be in the Euphrates River Valley, and it's hard to know exactly when that's going to conclude. Raqqa will take several more months, I expect.
Now, in Iraq, we have a partner in the Iraqi government. In Syria, we certainly don't have a partner in the Syrian government, although sometimes there's a whiff of welcoming the Syrian government to play a certain role. Our partners are principally opposition groups, Kurds, Arabs, and others. How does the United States deal? Do we deal well with opposition groups, rebel groups, as our principal partners?
Look, they create by definition a kind of confusion. You look at the Kurdish group, the YPG, which is it's the main force that we're backing in terms of trying to take back Raqqa, and obviously there's a fundamental divide there between the YPG, which clearly has connections to the PKK.
The Turkish terrorist group.
Yes, which is on our terrorism list, and which obviously the Turkey feels is their main terrorist opponent, and that creates a tension with Turkey.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about the great power game in Syria, Russia, Iran, America, and what our goal in this arena really ought to be in just a moment. So, gentlemen, let's take a look at the great power politics in this arena. A couple of years ago, Russia emerged as a major player after not being a key actor here. And we all know that Iran is a major player with huge deployments of its militias and its military and financial support to Assad. What should America's objective be in this arena? Should we view Russia as a partner? Are they a key partner in resolving this? Do we have similar or at least parallel objectives? Or is Russia an adversary in Syria with whom we don't share objectives? Brian, what do you think?
In some ways, it may be both, and I'm not sure I can adequately explain that contradiction, but let me try. So Russia came in and intervened to save the Syrian state. At the time, here in Washington, we were talking about catastrophic success, possibility that the Assad regime was on its last legs and we would have some bad actors taking over in Damascus. Russia intervened to prevent that outcome, and they did so successfully. They've saved the Assad regime. They said they came in to fight terrorists. They've done very little to fight terrorists. And so as long as their primary objective is saving the Assad regime and not countering ISIS, we don't have a full commonality of interests. But in a larger sense, we do have an interest in stability and ultimately some resolution of the conflict in Syria, because the instability that it is creating in the region and also in the flow of foreign fighters back to Europe is a significant security problem for the United States, for Europe, our partners and allies in the Middle East. So we share that interest because there are also terrorists who are going back to Russia and present a security threat to Russia.
So how do we balance this?
Well, The Obama administration sought to balance it by focusing on an ISIS-first strategy, but at the same time still having a position that there was no future for President Assad in a future Syrian government. That was a clear policy decision and signal, and the predicate for efforts at a negotiated solution. A lot of the opposition groups are not going to sit down and accept an Assad regime, and so I fear that the civil war will drag on for some time because of that fact.
And so, Dennis, how do we avoid the fact that we're helping make this arena a place of success for the Iranians and the Russians?
I think that gets back to the essence of what you're asking, which is what's our objective? Well, it would be great to be able to have a unitary Syrian state. I don't see that. I see the civil war continuing for the very reasons that Brian said. I don't think that you're going to get opposition groups there to live with the idea that they have to accept Assad. He's killed too many people. So if the reality is number one, you're not going to be able to have a unitary state. And the second reality is that you don't want Iran to be able to extend its presence so that it is on the border with Jordan, which means they will then seek to destabilize Jordan. They're on the border with Israel, which means the risk of a second front there producing another conflict, a much broader war with the Israelis, is something we don't want to see. Our objective should be to say, all right, you know what, we can live with a de facto partition. We can accept that we're not going to, we can't roll, we're not going to roll back Assad. We're not going to try to remove the Russian presence from Syria, and we're not able to remove the Iranian presence from Syria, but we're not going to allow the Iranian presence to expand. You know, where they are now is where they're going to be, and we're prepared to enforce the ceasefire agreement with the Russians. The only way this ceasefire agreement actually works is if Putin understands that if he doesn't enforce it, we will. That runs the risk for him of raising the cost. Once he sees that the cost for him in Syria might go up at a time when he's got what he wants. He's got an air base there now. He's going to expand a naval presence there now. He's clearly an arbiter. He doesn't need to see this drag on. But right now, his own posture is basically one that is abetting the spread of Iranian power. He has to understand we won't accept that, but he could have us as a partner if he's prepared to accept a kind of de facto partition where they're limited.
Now, reading between the lines, you're suggesting at least the promise or the threat of an American commitment of greater use of force, yes, if needed. Now, both President Obama and President Trump have talked about this part of the world as being a swamp. You know, stay out of it if you can. Yes, keep a narrow focus on destroying ISIS, but this is something different. Is our political system ready for this type of potential commitment?
Well, first of all, the kind of things I'm talking about, I'm not talking about rolling the Iranians back. That would require a very different kind of military commitment. I'm talking about doing, in a sense, in a more systematic way, what the Trump administration has already done. When chemical weapons were used, there was a retaliation. When there were threats upon where our special forces were, we took out a drone and then we took out a convoy. Each time we said our focus is ISIS, not these forces, but we'll defend ourselves. I would like us to take that a step further and say, where the Iranians are, okay, we may not like it, but we're not rolling them back. But they need to understand, if they press further, we will take out those forces. So it does require something more. It's also a way to exert leverage on the Russians. We've had 3 previous deals with the Russians, and none of them have held because there was no leverage that we were prepared to apply to them. So I'm talking about, how do you apply leverage in the service of an objective? I'm not unmindful of the desire not to get sucked in more, but let's recognize that Putin himself doesn't want to get sucked in a whole lot more either. He's not there to take back every inch for the Assad regime.
And Brian, do you think America has the staying power for this sort of slight shift in our strategy in the post-Mosul, post-Raqqa moment?
I'm not sure where the American politics and the American public are on that. I think there's a distaste deepening the involvement in the Middle East, and you saw that back in 2013 when President Obama paused on the retaliatory strikes for the use of chemical weapons and sought congressional approval for it. There's a reason it didn't get voted on by Congress. Congress wasn't enthusiastic because they were reflecting the American public opinion at the moment. Wars end when either external powers force an end to it or the people on the ground fighting decide they can't get any more in the battlefield and they decide to negotiate. I don't see either of those two outcomes in the near term leading to an end of the Civil War. So it's going to grind on, unfortunately, for the Syrian people.
Well, on that unhappy note, I regret that our time has come to a close. Brian, Dennis, thank you very much for joining us to discuss this very important topic today in Dakhel, Washington. هذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول تطورات السياسة الأمريكية خلال إيران، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.